Now is Tom Mulcair, CTV's political commentator and former NDP leader. Tom, good morning. Nice to see you.
Good to be with you, Marcia.
So I want to begin by asking you about Canada's role in the conflict. We announced last week that $10 million in funding for humanitarian assistance would be provided. Do you see more in the coming days?
I do, and I think that Joe Biden showed the way. Now, proportionally, our 10 million is pretty darn close to what the Americans' 100 million would represent as a proportion. I do think that Canada can and should be doing more because this is going to turn into a humanitarian crisis when we talk about innocent civilians. Those exist on both sides, obviously. In the wake of the horrific and unprecedented terrorist attack by Hamas against innocent Israeli citizens, of course, the world, much of the Western world at least, has risen as one saying, okay, this is a line that's been crossed and something has to be done. But at the same time, as Mr. Trudeau learned this week within his own caucus, he's got very different points of view, but the correct way to proceed. So we've seen Melanie Joly head to Israel. We know that there have been contacts at the highest level. She seems to be doing a pretty good job of doing what she can, but Canada itself is being left behind. We saw the 5 countries of the so-called Quint, that's United States, Great Britain, Italy, Germany, and France, sign a joint statement. Canada's been left out. So I don't think that we're being seen as really important players, but if we can do our bit to get humanitarian aid into Gaza to these innocent civilians, well, that'll be a good thing.
Do you expect the Prime Minister to travel to Israel? Do you think he should meet with Benjamin Netanyahu?
I don't think that a procession of Western leaders at this point would be indicated. There are lots of countries who are putting strong efforts behind helping Israel now and helping to try to come to grips with the humanitarian situation and talk with them. I think that the most important one was Netanyahu. Biden had an important message. I mean, he was saying, look, we've done this before in the wake of 9/11. We made mistakes. I mean, for an American president to cite the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and say that the United States made mistakes, that's historic. That's really important. He was sharing that with the world, not just with Benjamin Netanyahu. It's one thing to lash out and to react, but it's another thing to have a longer term plan. And that's what the Americans learned, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think that cooler heads will show that, yes, Israel does know how to deal with an existential threat. It's been attacked on all sides since it was created by the United Nations in 1948, and this is the most horrific attack they've been through. But they are experienced at this. They do know that there is going to be a tomorrow once the dust settles on this, and they've got to play their cards right.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those remarks that that Biden made. I also want to ask you about the situation here at home, because things are heating up. We're seeing protests, we're seeing demonstrations that are getting ugly, I'll just put it that way. What do you think the message needs to be in this country, perhaps from leaders, about toning down the rhetoric?
Good point. And I think that you can have civilized discussions on both sides. We have a very diverse country. It's not surprising that we have diverse points of view because those diverse points of view are held around the world. One of the biggest things that's happened, I think, since those horrible attacks by the terrorist group Hamas on Israeli citizens is that the Israeli explanation that was often rejected in the Western world, their explanation that, look, these groups, these terrorist groups, their purpose is to kill Jews and to try to destroy the state of Israel. That was seen as perhaps overstatement. Iran has made it clear that they want to kill Jews and eliminate the state of Israel. Hamas has made it abundantly clear that their purpose is to kill Jews and eliminate the state of Israel. But when correct thinking, in their view, Canadians get into a march and chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they're saying is that from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, the state of Israel will be gone. So, they'll argue, well, no, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. But then the question is, well, aren't you forgetting about the 8.5 million Jews who happen to live in the country that was indeed created by the United Nations, that's been able to survive despite attacks from all sides since it was created 75 years ago? And that reality, I think, has struck home with a lot of Canadians. But the reality of what we just talked about, the horrors that are besieging a couple of million civilians who have done nothing wrong in Gaza and who are waiting now, like the rest of the world, to see what happens, that's something that we have to be part of finding a solution for. And I'll say, Marcia, that we know where this begins, going back to Biden, but we don't know where this ends. There's a very strong force on Israel's northern border called Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm.
They are under the tutelage, as was Hamas, of Iran and Syria, respectively. So, what happens if there's a massive fight that takes place there? What's the reaction going to be? The Americans have sent in 2 aircraft carriers with their full strike forces. We're talking 90 combat vessels. That represents firepower that's bigger than the air forces of almost every country in the world. But what happens if the Americans move in? What's the reaction of other countries going to be? And they've all got their protectors, as Iran is very close to Russia right now. So with the backdrop of everything that's happened in Ukraine for the past year and a half, we have to keep all of that in mind as we move forward, because we know that we're heading for a very strong use of ground troops in Gaza by Israel. So we're going to all watch with great trepidation as this plays out and pray for peace.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of Lebanon, Tom, I think a lot of people took a bit of pause when Melanie Joly came out the other day and encouraged people to leave immediately while there were still commercial flights available. I think people were wondering, what does she know that we don't? Why?
Canada has a huge Lebanese diaspora, especially in the province of Quebec, because most of the people who come in speak French. And it's a huge concern for those communities. And I'm glad you mentioned Melanie Joly's intervention, because it was crystal clear. And it's rare. She's a good politician. And it's rare for politicians not to have a wooden tongue on these things. Well, it would be desirable. It would be better if. No, it was like, get out while you still can. So clearly she was signaling that this has to be taken very seriously. And that if you're sitting there in Beirut right now with your family and your Canadian passports, get on a plane and come back to Canada and work the rest of it out later. So I think that is a clear indication that she does indeed know that this could very quickly spill over into Lebanon, which would, again, begin a spiraling that would be very difficult to predict in terms of outcome.
And one final question for you, circling back to Biden and to humanitarian aid. Do you think that Biden's visit to the region was a success? Of course, the other summit got called off in Jordan following the hospital bombing. But do you think that Biden accomplished something by going over there?
Yes, I think it was a major success for American diplomacy and for President Biden to be there first and foremost to say that they stand by Israel, as they always have, and to say at the same time that they were going to put up $100 million for humanitarian aid. And be careful, because you know where this stuff begins and you don't know where it ends. I think that those were all crystal clear messages that he was sending, and I think that it was absolutely essential he be there. I don't think that we know where this thing's going to end, and that's one of the biggest problems that we all have.
I think we lost our connection with Tom. Tom Mulcair, thank you so much. If you can still hear me, appreciate your time with us this morning.